Hey gang, as true crime fans, we know there's always more to the story. And the start of a new year is a perfect time to start digging deeper into the mysteries that fascinate you with newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive.
Imagine uncovering the original articles that reported on infamous crimes or tracking down small town stories that haven't been told in decades. A subscription to newspapers.com unlocks over 1 billion, with a B, newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond, dating all the way back to 1690 or as recent as a month ago.
You'll have access to stories that you will not find anywhere else. From front page headlines to forgotten cases that could inspire your next deep dive. Go down a rabbit hole of first-hand accounts, breaking news, and shocking details that didn't make the history books, all on newspapers.com.
For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering a special discount of 20%. Just use the code TrueCrimecast at checkout. The clues to history's mysteries are waiting for you on newspapers.com using code TrueCrimecast.
Stoveleg Media, igniting conversation.
This is True Crime Cast. Jamie recording with John for the first time in what seems like forever. No frozen, pun intended.
Yeah, dude, it's we've got a frozen tundra over here.
Yeah, it is completely frozen here. Our kids have not been to school since before Christmas.
Yeah, I don't know that they're ever going back either. Like when we're recording this, it's snowing again. Kids are out of school, and then it's supposed to snow all weekend, even on Monday. I don't know.
Yeah, it's just our country is, speaking in weather terms, just kind of a mess. Like with
we've got freezing cold here, fires that have devastated California, man.
Yeah, thoughts and prayers to all our folks out there. I know a lot of people have lost homes or having to evacuate, and even those that aren't directly impacted, the city's focused on that. So it's a huge deal. So hopefully everybody out there is safe and taking care of yourselves, and if you're over here, drive safely and bundle up.
Absolutely. We got an interesting case today, man. I'm really excited to get into it. But before I do, I want to say a special thank you to a couple of folks. Some folks joined us over on Patreon. We have Suds Media, who joined us for an annual membership. That's $30 for a whole year. That's incredible. So that's a discount for sure. And then Brian Armstrong joined us, $3 a month. So Brian and Suds, thank you guys.
Brian Armstrong is a name of a professional wrestler. Don't know if it's him. If it is, hit us up. I'd love to chat.
We do have some folks joining us that heard us on Talk is Jericho, so perhaps it is.
Maybe. We appreciate all those that support us, and it's, I don't know. This season, John, I've really struggled coming out of the Christmas break funk. Like, I don't know, sleeping in every day, not working very much, and then trying to get back into things has been really tough. So
eating like crap.
Oh God. Yeah. Still like I am 1/3 peanut butter right now, I think, but it's helped me to get out of that funk as I've gotten back to work. We're getting back into recording, and we talk about it sometimes on other episodes, but that's Magic Mind. It's focus, a mental health shot that helps me stay alert, stay focused, stay on top of what I'm trying to do. And a piece of this is we often talk about investing in wealth in a variety of elements of our life. And what about mental wealth, where you're taking time to invest in habits and supplements that help you to stay healthy? Right now, for the first time ever, Magic Mind is offering the 24-hour pack. That is focus and sleep shots bundled up for the first time at a 45% discount exclusive to our listeners. Make sure you're taking your mental wealth seriously and investing in yourself. And how do they get that pack, John?
Yeah, it's really easy. There's a website. I do want to talk though, Jamie, you've been doing the daily shots in the morning. I do the Magic Mind sleep. And for me, getting back to work, my mind is racing, and I've got like a million things to do to wrap up 2024, even though we're almost halfway through 2020, January of 25. But the Magic Mind Sleep just helps me to rest and relax and shut my mind down. But you can get that by going to that website is magicmind.com/VIP J and Jan, like J and J, but the last J is Jan for January.
For January.
So again, that's magicmind.com/VIP JANDJAN.
There you go. Make sure you check that out, guys, and get yourself started this year on a positive note. And I think we're going to get started on an interesting case. I don't know if it's a positive case. You know, we've been in a lot of social media interactions with folks around the country lately as TikTok, if it lives another week, then continues to grow. And we're interacting with people, and it continues to be fascinating to me, these dark stories, the things that people are able to take from them, whether that's hope or learning lessons or protecting yourself. So I like telling these stories, not always happy stories, but this is a good one. So why don't you go ahead and get us rolling?
Today, we're going to go look at the case of Leslie Irvin. This is what seemed like an ordinary man, but he harbored a very dark secret. In the early 1950s, there was a wave of terror that came through the rural communities of southwestern Indiana and Kentucky, and it left a trail of death and fear in its wake. Who is this guy we're talking about? Leslie Irvin.
He's the Mad Dog Killer, which, as far as serial killer nicknames go, Mad Dog's a pretty tough one. He was a family man. He had a steady job. And if you just saw him out on the street, you would just say, "Hey, Leslie, how's your day?" But as we look back now, his name kind of rings with terror in the ears of victims and those that were impacted. And in this case, went on to impact other cases as well. And we'll get into that.
Yeah, so we're going to kind of walk you through the events and the terrifying string of murders that took place. The police investigation, we're going to walk through that ultimately led to his capture. And then the legal battle, which was very interesting and would ultimately go to the highest court in the land, that being the Supreme Court, and its chilling impact on the American justice system.
Yeah, so we're going back to December of 1954, and the first victim to fall to the Mad Dog Killer was Mary Holland. Now, she was 33 years old. She was a clerk at a local store, and she was expecting a child. One day in 1954, in December, she was found shot to death at close range, and her body was discovered in the store she worked at.
Again, an expectant mother had to just be a horrific sight for investigators to walk in on. Just a few weeks later, Wesley Kerr, who was a gas station attendant, met a very similar fate. He was discovered shot to death in the restroom of the gas station where he worked. Both of these people, both victims, were found with their hands bound, suggesting a calculated and deliberate attack.
And if this happens once, you know, it certainly makes headlines and people get a little nervous. But if this happens twice in the same way, I think it starts to, I don't know, make people second guess how they're living their lives. And set a little bit more context. Southwest Indiana, Kentucky, I mean, this is not super rural area, but this is hometown America. This is, I guess you would call that part the Midwest, depending on who you ask in Kentucky. But this is Mayberry, right? This is Pleasantville. These things didn't happen here. So people were really freaking out. There were shockwaves throughout the community. Doors were locked. And again, this is the 50s. People weren't locking their doors before then. You were sending your kids out to play all day. They were kept a little bit closer to home. And these quiet towns in that area started having more of an eerie silence in addition to the quietness.
In March of 1955, the terror would continue to escalate. That's when Wilma Lena Saylor, a 47-year-old housewife, was found murdered in her home. And the brutality of this attack with Miss Saylor shot at close range really went, it escalated the fear in the community. there was a lot of anxiety within the community at this point, and I think that's when there was a switch. You mentioned people not locking their doors. Well, now there's this overwhelming sense of fear in the neighborhood that these are random attacks and these people are not connected. So you could be next.
Well, and this person was the first one to be killed in their home. The first two victims, Wesley and Mary, were both killed at their jobs, but Miss Saylor was killed in her home. So I think that just escalates or elevates the level of concern the community had. Just a few days later, there was an incident in Henderson County, Kentucky, which, again, out in western Kentucky, and this one was even more horrific. Farmer Goebel Duncan, his wife Mamie, and their son Raymond were brutally attacked inside their home. Their daughter-in-law Elizabeth was also killed in this attack. She was married to Raymond's brother, so she wasn't there with her husband. She was essentially the other daughter-in-law. Anyway, Mamie would somehow survive. She was shot in the temple, John, and lived through this. She did lose her vision eventually and had other complications, but she lived. But Goebel, Raymond, and Elizabeth were all killed in this attack. And again, this is right across the river. The Ohio River is the northern border of Kentucky. Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana all touch it there. This is across the river, but I'm sure the people in Kentucky, as they would say back then, they'd heard tell about the stories happening in Indiana.
Yeah, now it's hitting here in our home state. So yeah, this scene that you just described was awful, and it just really demonstrated the sheer brutality of whoever was behind these acts. The bodies of Goebel and his son were found in a nearby swamp, and Mamie and Elizabeth were discovered in the farmhouse. But there was somebody else there. There was 2-year-old Shirley Faye, who was Elizabeth's daughter, and she was found unharmed in the same room as her mother. A chilling reminder that, this person decided to kill everyone in the home except for this kid.
Yeah.
And left her there. So there's really, I don't know, it's not predictable. There's no rhyme or reason, but apparently they had a soft spot for this kid.
One report that I read said that Elizabeth, when police approached her, and again, she was in the room with her mother who had been killed, she just kept saying, "Mommy's sleeping," which she's 2 years old. So I have to assume that that's some of her, like she's just learning to talk, and this is her trying to express what she perceived as happening. But that's a beginning of a lifelong trauma that nobody deserves. The investigation was complex and challenging. Obviously, we didn't have the internet. We didn't have ways to communicate quickly. So these are 4 different crime scenes in 2 states. It's going to be hard to put it all together. Police did their best. They tried to piece together the evidence, interview witnesses at each location, and follow up on every lead. But crossing state lines, the fact that these victims really didn't seem to be connected made this a really tough investigation.
Well, thankfully, the police got a break in the case, and this was huge. So this came when a group of young people in Vandenberg County, which was, and we get this source from the Evansville Courier article called Mad Dog, an Evansville Serial Killer Goes on Trial. It was written by John Webb. I want to stop there and say that we have some exciting news coming up soon from a company that I'm really excited about. I guess we can't go into that right now, but excited to see that coming soon. Anyway, in that article, these young men, which included Gary Perman, spotted a suspicious vehicle near the scene of the Duncan murders, and they even took note of the car's license plate number, which for a group of teenagers is just really impressive for me.
There's no way I would have thought to do that as a teenager. I mean, now a teenager would pull out their phone and take a picture of it, but
if they even noticed it, like if they took their head away from their phone long enough to notice it, they might put it on a TikTok.
And I would almost assume that they also didn't have pen and paper with them. So I'm thinking that they memorized this maybe as a group. You remember the first 2, I'll remember the next 2, whatever. Super impressed and thankful that they were able to do this.
Well, they gave that license plate number to police, and when police were able to look it up, it led them to Leslie Irvin, who, again, was a local man with a history of criminal activity, including a prior conviction for indecent exposure.
we get back from the break, we'll dive more into the past of Leslie Irvin and talk about how he became the Mad Dog Killer. So Leslie Irvin, we opened the show talking about him a little bit, and he was a guy that lived in the community and worked as an ice cream truck driver. John, looking back, we know that there's some serial killers that have operated out of these. There's the old trope about somebody trying to lure kids into a van or a truck with candy or ice cream. But ice cream truck drivers in general, in your community, when you get to know them, they're like celebrities. You come around my neighborhood, you're playing that little jingle, everybody starts chasing your truck.
I live in the same neighborhood. I've never once heard an ice cream truck.
Oh,
I live pretty
awkward.
far off the road, though. Like, can you just call me next time?
Probably not. I don't want them to run out.
I want that Mickey Mouse ear ice cream.
That's exactly what I was going to say. It's the ice cream coated in chocolate. Anyway, he was an ice cream truck driver, and you're going to get mixed reviews about his role in this. Some people would say, like, yeah, he was always nice in our neighborhood. He would come through, serve the ice cream, and do it with a smile. Others would say that, you know what, his criminal reputation followed him, and we never trusted him or never let our kids go around his ice cream truck. He was often seen driving throughout the neighborhoods, but often among whispers about what he may have been doing when he was off the clock. And that's the connection that was found between his vehicle and the Duncan murders, and it raised serious suspicions.
The police investigation intensified. They were able to examine Irvin's movements. They interviewed his associates and meticulously searched for any evidence that could link him to the crimes. They traced his movements. They analyzed his financial records and conducted surveillance on his activities. They are 130% like eagle eye watching this guy. I don't think he could go to the bathroom without them knowing.
You know, it's funny. I look at this and my immediate reaction is they are doing a bang up job. They're looking at everything, digging into this guy. If we were telling a different story and he was found not to be the person involved, I would say that they have tunnel vision and they're wasting their time. So it's interesting, knowing the end of the story, how it changes the way you view actions in it. But they are, like you said, all in on Leslie Irvin, trying to track him down and using all their resources. And for the 1950s, they're doing a great job. As the investigation progressed, they started to see a pattern. His ice cream truck route coincided with all of the areas that these murders had taken place in. This, along with his previous criminal record, told police that they had somebody that they could definitely consider a suspect, a person of interest, whatever you want to call him, but this isn't somebody they're going to write off and say, oh, that's a coincidence. They're going to keep digging.
This is this is in the 1950s, right? So I picture the police department having this huge bulletin board with a map of the area, and there's thumbtacks or some kind of marker indicating where all the murder victims were.
A little drawing of an ice cream truck.
And then there's an ice cream truck route that just circles the entire thing. That's kind of what I picture, but it's true. And they did coincide. The pressure mounted as the community grew increasingly anxious. Could you imagine in our small community if something like this was going on? I mean, right now our neighborhood kind of feels like the 90s. Like our kids go out and play. They have a good time, but I'm going to stop letting them do that as much as if there's random attacks leaving people dead.
And usually when we cover people like this, it's happening in big cities. You have to have access to a large population. You have to have a level of anonymity if you're going to do these things. So when it happens in a small town, I think it becomes increasingly more difficult to continue to get away with it. I know some people have, but families are really going to start to huddle together and say something has to be done, as opposed to this being in, I don't know, somewhere like New York City, and they're like, we got 4 of these going on. Everybody kind of knows it's dangerous. Let's be careful, but it's not a a new level of alert like it was in southwestern Indiana.
And because of it being a smaller town, I mean, we're not talking about New York City here. We're talking about a community that is a pretty good sized community, but they were able to put pressure on the police. Like, you have got to solve this because we are tired of living in this fear. I mean, it basically is terrorism. I mean, these people, it disrupted their whole lives and their sense of stability and safety that they had.
Yeah, you and I have been covering, and we did last week on True Crime to Go, a story developing in Laurel County, Kentucky, where police served a warrant at the wrong house. Somebody lost their life. And we followed up with some videos where the public was putting pressure on the city to do something, to change practices, to do an investigation. Public pressure, I think, has always been one of the more powerful needles that have moved governmental decisions. And this is certainly the case here. So as the police had that pressure put on them, they applied all this pressure to Leslie Irvin. Eventually they brought him in and said, look, this is what we've got. And he pretty readily confessed to these murders. He was able to give them chilling details of each and every crime, showing his disturbing pattern of violence, telling why he wanted to do it. And you could just tell him how he told the stories, just like many of these killers, he had no regard at all for human life.
Irwin described how he would get his victims into isolated locations, often using his ice cream truck as a means of gaining their trust. He then carried out the brutal attacks and displaying of just very chilling indifference to human life. And what he did was sick. It was awful.
Yeah, and I guess that in a small town like this, everybody does know everybody. So even if he did have a bad reputation, he was still very well known in these communities. So to be able to say that man, who I have seen on these occasions has done these awful things, is really impactful to a community like this. So as soon as he confessed and the word got out he was the guy, the community continued to, like, I can just hear, like in a courtroom when the steady rumble of conversation builds up. That's what I picture happening here throughout the community when Irvin was arrested.
And the public was outraged and they demanded swift justice. This is the 1950s, but in my mind, it almost harkens back to the 1800s where you were arrested and hung within days.
Yeah.
And that
was mostly public pressure too. Like a lynch mob would form and take you out. If you shot somebody's horse, you were done for.
Yeah. And it has similarities to that. Honestly, the media sensationalized this case. And
no, media wouldn't do that, John.
They portrayed Irvin as a monstrous figure, and that even further would go to fuel the public outrage. I mean, to be fair, he was a monstrous figure, especially if he's convicted. But, you know, at the time and even today, you're innocent until proven guilty. So yes, he may be monstrous, but let's go through the legal process first. There were headlines going through town like Mad Dog Killer, and that's how he got the nickname. But these kind of headlines dominated the newspapers, which would go on to further create a climate of fear and hysteria.
And when I think about this, I think about the old radio news programs, and the accents are like, and the Mad Dog Killer is here and you better lock your doors. I don't know what regional dialect that was, but that's what I hear. That
sounded more like Boston, but probably similar in Western Indiana.
Love a good Boston accent. The trial itself was a media circus. And again, back then the media is newspapers primarily, maybe some radios out there, but it's mostly newspapers. And they extensively covered this case in detail. Every time the court met, whether it was a pretrial hearing, the trial itself, anytime the media was allowed in the door, they were there. And everything they wrote continued to build Irvin up as this murderous monster, again, that he was. And they really highlighted the gruesome details of the murders to feed into their headlines.
Which can become a problem when you're discussing trial. I mean, there were serious concerns about the possibility of if this could even be a fair trial.
Can we just talk about this in general for a minute? I made a TikTok last week about Victor Martinez Hernandez, who's the man that's been arrested for the murder of Rachel Marin.
Right.
And he is seeking a change of venue.
Okay.
Due to Hartford County, Maryland not being a place he can get a fair trial. In the year 2025, which sounds like it's way in the future, but it's now, is there, due to our the availability of media at all times, is there a place that, like, is this, should this still be a thing? Like, if he moves it to the next county, are they less aware of it? Maybe a bit, but everybody, the word spreads. It's on your phones. I would have never known about Rachel Marin's murder if this was the 50s or even the 80s, but now I know all the details because I can read about it. I can watch videos. So I wonder if this fair trial piece is going to become less about physical location, I guess is my question.
Yeah. And I mean, to just bring about, just to talk about the point of Rachel Marin's case, I mean, you're right. If you move it a county over or 2 counties over, I think that jury pool is going to be just as impacted as the one would be in the home county, right? I mean, you're talking about, are you going to have to potentially, I mean, is there going to ever be a time where you're going to have to go to a completely different geographic location? Like, you can't go out of state because it's a state level trial. So yeah, I see. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I guess that's when attorneys are going to have to really, like, maybe increase the size of their jury pool and then be more selective as to who they bring on. But yeah, with the internet in your pocket, it is hard to make the case that it would be a different outcome somewhere else.
At this time, though, in the 50s, when Leslie Irvin was going to trial, this was a reality. You could go 30 miles away and nobody's ever heard of any of this. So this was a real conversation to have there, just something that's been on my mind lately. So his defense team would argue that due to this media coverage, especially the harsh headlines and the details, had prejudiced the public against their client, making it impossible to find an impartial jury. They argue that this had poisoned the jury pool throughout the region and made it impossible for a fair trial, and they were looking to have the trial moved as far away as they could.
Well, it did move, but only to a neighboring county. So the defense team continued to argue that the coverage was pervasive enough that it has poisoned the jury pool throughout that region as well. So they wanted it to be even further away.
And you know, when they moved it, that didn't slow the media down. The media followed this case. They went to the litigation that happened in this neighboring county, but the local media from the original county, as well as the local media from the new area, started piling on. So this essentially brought more media coverage to it. All of it was negative. There wasn't anybody out there claiming they've got the wrong guy. This was pretty much all in the direction of lock him up and throw away the key.
This is a situation where it's straight out of like an old movie, but the courtroom there's several pictures of this because the reporters were packed in the courtroom. Their camera lenses were the old style, the really big ones that would flash really brightly. They had notebooks that they were scribbling in. This was an intense presence for the media. And it, again, the reason we're talking about that is because it put an immense amount of pressure on the defense team that fueled this public outrage. I mean, this reminds me a lot of, I don't know just how sensationalized Bonnie and Clyde was, but it's different in that I feel like a lot of public or society as a whole were kind of on Bonnie and Clyde's side.
Yeah.
At this instance, in this case, the public is on the media side and they want like justice yesterday for this guy.
And the headlines were really competing with each other. So if you had an outlandish headline that got attention, I was going to have to one up you and say something absolutely ridiculous. And that's what they were doing. So some newspapers painted him as a manipulative con man that did all these things. Other people said that he was this kind of rageful monster that was only guided by his gut and not very smart at all. So either way, he's a monster, but it wasn't really a consistent picture drawn of him because you wanted your coverage to be unique.
So the Mad Dog Killer moniker was coined by the prosecution during the trial, and that became synonymous with Leslie Irvin. Like if you look Leslie Irvin up, it's almost like Mad Dog Killer is his middle name. Leslie Mad Dog Killer Irvin, which not a great thing for this particular case, but like if that was my football name, that'd be John the Mad Dog Bailey. Like that's okay, but this was in reference to cold-blooded murder, so that's not a good thing. This label, along with the graphic descriptions of the murders in the media, created a powerful and enduring image of Irvin as this monstrous figure.
As you can imagine, it did not take long for the jury to reach a verdict. They found Irvin guilty of first-degree murder. They recommended the death penalty. Obviously, that's controversial now. In the 50s, it was much less controversial, and I think most people were on board with, yes, let's do that if that's an option. Let's get rid of this killer and get him off the streets. But this was really the end of that trial, but the beginning of a different legal battle.
Irvin, however, would not face the electric chair. His case would soon become a landmark legal battle that would challenge the very foundations of the American justice system. That battle was Irvin versus Dowd.
Yeah.
So why don't you tell us more about that? Sorry.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about the media coverage, and that's not just because we were fascinated by it. That's a key part of this case and what happened after. His defense team appealed the conviction based on the extensive media coverage, claiming it created an atmosphere of prejudice in the area. They argued that it was pervasive, it was sensationalized, and really he had no shot at a free trial anywhere, or at a fair trial anywhere in the region. So this isn't just them complaining publicly. This is the attorneys saying this made an actual difference in the case. We deserve to have the verdict overturned because of it.
The defense contended that jurors, despite their claims of being impartial, had been unavoidably influenced by the constant barrage of negative media coverage. And like you said, they argued that the intense media scrutiny had created an atmosphere of fear and hysteria that made it impossible for Irvin to receive a fair trial and just an impartial trial. These people were inundated with seeing his face every time they walked into a store. Do you remember how big newspaper, like when you walked into a store, the display was there?
Huge.
Like, you couldn't walk into a store without that being one of the very first things you saw.
This case ultimately went to, like you said, the highest court in the land. In America, the U.S. Supreme Court is it. You cannot appeal to anyone higher than that. And this led to a landmark decision. The Supreme Court in this case recognized the profound impact that the media had on the trial, and they concluded that Irvin had been denied his right to a free trial based on the media coverage, which, again, 1950s, we're talking newspapers, we're talking radio, not internet, not TikTok, not Instagram, just basic bare bones media was enough to deny him a fair trial back then, which was huge for not only Leslie Irvin, but for future cases that this came up in.
Absolutely. I mean, this is the Supreme Court. This is what every single state would have to look towards in the future anytime this issue came up. And trust me, it comes up a lot. I mean,
all the time.
You think it's not gotten better since the 50s. It's gotten much worse. I mean, you mentioned TikTok. Think about what's happening in Laurel County right now. People across the world know about this because of TikTok, whereas before, maybe people in Kentucky, I don't know if we would, based on we live an hour away. Who knows?
Not unironically, the Supreme Court at the time of this recording is all that stands between us and losing TikTok. So throwing that out there.
January 19th. It's going to be a fun day. See what happens.
I hope not.
The Supreme Court emphasized that a fair trial requires an impartial jury, free from the undue influence of media bias. And the court acknowledged that this case was anything but that there was extensive media coverage, and it created an atmosphere that was not conducive to him receiving a fair trial. And he confessed, we know it's him, but you still have to have a fair trial.
Right. And we don't have a lot of the transcripts from that trial and whether how big of a piece his confession was in the trial, but obviously he was pleading not guilty here. This set a precedent in the American justice system. It allowed for guidelines to be put in place to try and ensure fair trials in cases, especially those with significant media coverage. It really kind of flipped the switch on the paradigm or point of view back toward the rights of the accused, because our Constitution says innocent until proven guilty, and I don't think the public feels that same way. So this case was able to kind of shift that focus back in that direction, I believe.
Well, and something that I've been thinking about throughout discussing this case is just how much access to the case the media had, not just to the trials, but talking about some of the details from each crime that a lot of times now, and I think it's because of this Supreme Court decision, if a lot of times if a news company or a news outlet has those intimate details, it's because of a leak. But you don't want to have those very personal, intimate details released to the public before the trial, because that could definitely hinder the police work and ultimately the outcome of the case in trial. So that really kind of changed the legal landscape, so to speak, of things moving forward.
It did. And I think recently about the Richard Allen trial for the Delphi murders, and that was not televised. And at the time I was thinking, man, I really want to watch this. I want to be involved. But if there is an appeal of that verdict and they have to do another trial, it would be great to have people who didn't know everything that happened in the courtroom that day. So I think the decision not to have that trial televised was in the vein of Irvin versus Dowd, to try to keep from further polluting the jury pool. They only recently released the gag order in that case, where police and others could talk about things publicly. So this really not only set this precedent for media coverage, but in my opinion, it really changed the landscape of our justice system in terms of, yes, we have to ensure that we are giving the accused a fair trial, not just say it, not just go through the motions. We have to actively remove barriers to free trials, and that costs more money, more time in our legal system, more frustration for victims' families. But I think it's a very important part of the process, John.
Well, and because the Supreme Court ultimately ruled that he did not have a fair trial, the story doesn't end there, but he was retried and convicted on June 13th of 1962. This time he was sentenced to life in prison. His hobby in prison was handmade leather work, but he ended up dying in the Indiana State Prison in Michigan City on November 9th of 1983. He died of lung cancer. So I don't think that the outcome, as far as he didn't get the electric chair, he didn't face the death penalty for his crimes, but he did spend the rest of his life in prison, which is probably the best case of justice that his victims could get. I think that anytime you have to go to trial and then it's overturned by the Supreme Court, going back for a retrial and getting that sentence is probably the best you're going to do.
Yeah, that was probably best case scenario for him. And it's interesting. We see advocates and victims' families often pursuing appeals and other things to try to prevent further things or future incidents from impacting people negatively. I don't think that was Irvin's goal here. I don't think he was saying, I need to help future accused murderers to not have, no, I think he was trying to get out of jail, but his actions do continue to impact us today. And this is a case that, like I said, I was frustrated about the Richard Allen case not being televised, but looking at it through this lens, I see, you know what, I get it, and I support it. So certainly something to consider for all us true crime fans that want to know everything all the time. Sometimes it's best to make sure people get their fair shake.
It makes me think of the old movie with Pauly Shore, Jury Duty.
Yep.
One of my favorite Pauly Shore movies of all time. But I mean, are we going to live in a world where if there's a murder trial, like, are we going to have to give up our phones and have only supervised conversations with our loved ones and live in a hotel room during the duration of the trial to avoid any kind of public, media influencing our thoughts on the case?
I think there's some I think we're getting close in some areas, in some cases. How close are we to having AI be the jury? I mean, that's not a jury of your peers. That's a kind of a silly jab at it, but if we're looking for impartiality, taking the human element out of it may not be. I'm not advocating for that.
Could you
to be clear,
imagine the movie we could make with that in mind, though? Like, that's a really
we should
crazy
edit
concept.
this out. Season 3 of Left on Dead.
Yeah. So
The
yeah,
artificial jury.
I mean, humans are we're swayed and we are biased, and so I think you have to have people who don't know about the case, and then you have to restrict their access. I mean, if you tell me I'm going to be on the jury pool for this man who was arrested, what's the first thing I'm going to do? I'm going to Google that guy. I'm going to Google the case. So it's human nature to be inquisitive and to ask questions and to dig into it. And with, like I said, the internet is in our hands all the time. I don't know how you get around this and upheld this Supreme Court decision in all cases.
Absolutely. Guys, we appreciate you so much for hanging out here with us. This is a landmark case that honestly doesn't get a lot of attention. So glad to share this one, and would love to hear your feedback about your opinions on jury bias and media coverage, especially as true crime podcasters. I don't know, we base our work on some of these things. So would love to hear from you. Would love to have some 5-star reviews. We've got some awesome stuff over on Patreon. Just engage however you can. We love to hear from you. Been having some great interactions over on TikTok, as long as it's around.
Don't forget that this month, January of 2025, you do get a discount for joining Patreon. So I feel like it's already cheap, and hey, you can get it a little cheaper. So go join us over there.
Yep. We appreciate you guys, and we'll be back with another case of true crime to go this week.
Until next crime, this has been True Crimecast.
You've listened to True Crimecast, distributed by Stoveleg Media. Check out stoveleg.com to find out more about your hosts and to find other podcasts to listen to. Stoveleg Media, igniting conversation.
Hey, gang. As true crime fans, we know there's always more to the story. And the start of a new year is a perfect time to start digging deeper into the mysteries that fascinate you with newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive.
Imagine uncovering the original articles that reported on infamous crimes, or tracking down small town stories that haven't been told in decades. A subscription to newspapers.com unlocks over 1 billion, with a B, newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and beyond, dating all the way back to 1690 or as recent as a month ago.
You'll have access to stories that you will not find anywhere else. From front page headlines to forgotten cases that could inspire your next deep dive. Go down a rabbit hole of first-hand accounts, breaking news, and shocking details that didn't make the history books, all on newspapers.com.
For listeners of this podcast, newspapers.com is offering a special discount of 20%. Just use the code TRUECRIMECAST at checkout. The clues to history's mysteries are waiting for you on newspapers.com using code TRUECRIMECAST.